If you have ever stepped off an airplane in Amsterdam, Munich, or Stockholm, walked into the city center, and noticed something subtle was missing from the skyline above you, you have already seen the second-order effect of this video. The thing missing was the sky itself. In most American cities, especially in residential neighborhoods, look up, and you will see a web of wires crossing your view in every direction. Power lines, phone lines, cable internet, strung between wooden poles every 50 feet along every street, every road, every neighborhood across the country. The American sky is a grid of cables you have stopped noticing because they have been there your entire life. In most European cities, that grid does not exist. Look up in a Paris neighborhood. Look up in Berlin. Look up in Copenhagen. The sky is clean. No wires. No poles. No tangled mess of cables hanging above your head. Just sky and buildings. The power, the phones, the internet, all of it is there. It is just buried underneath your feet. This is one of the most visible infrastructure differences between the United States and Europe, and almost no American has any idea why it exists. The sky above your street looks like that for specific historical reasons that traced back to decisions made in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s in two completely different parts of the world. Here is what should bother you for the next 10 minutes. The American power grid was built quickly and cheaply during the rapid expansion of the country. Above-ground wiring on wooden poles was the fastest way to electrify millions of new homes after World War II. The European approach was slower, more expensive, and dramatically more vulnerable to bombing during the war, so the Europeans rebuilt their grid completely after the 1940s with one key difference. They put almost all of it underground. That single decision in the 1950s through the 1970s separated the two continents into completely different relationships with their own electrical infrastructure. And almost nothing about it has changed in the 70 years since. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why the wires above your street are still there, why every storm knocks them down, why a single tree branch can leave your entire neighborhood without power for days, and why Europe stopped having that problem half a century ago. Stay with me, because the third reason involves a single economic decision that locked the American grid into its current shape for the rest of this century at minimum. Here is the punchline up front. American power lines hang above streets not because nobody thought of burying them. They hang there because of three things stacked together that quietly locked the country into above-ground infrastructure. A post-war rebuilding gap that let Europe modernize while America stayed with its existing system. A geographic and economic reality that made underground wiring dramatically more expensive across America than Europe. And a utility regulation model that gave power companies no incentive to switch to a more expensive infrastructure their customers could not see. Take any one of those three away, and the American grid would start moving underground. Take all three away, which is essentially what Europe did. And you get the clean skylines, fewer outages, and dramatically lower storm vulnerability that Europeans take for granted. And here is the part most people never realize. Underground power lines are not just more expensive to install. They are also more expensive to repair. When something goes wrong, crews have to dig up streets, locate the fault, and physically excavate the damaged section. Above-ground wires are visible, accessible, and easy to fix. The American system is built around the assumption that things will break and need to be repaired quickly. The European system is built around the assumption that things will rarely break in the first place. Hidden Systems explains the everyday things in your neighborhood that look like simple, obvious infrastructure but are actually the result of decisions, geography, and economic models from generations ago. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Now let me walk you back to where this divergence started. In the 1940s and 1950s, both the United States and Europe were facing the same problem. How do you electrify millions of homes as quickly as possible? The American approach was speed. Wooden poles were cheap. Wire was abundant. Stringing cables between poles required minimal engineering and could be done by relatively unskilled labor at massive scale. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, the American grid expanded faster than any electrical infrastructure project in human history. Tens of millions of homes were connected in just a few decades. Above-ground wiring made that speed possible. European countries were dealing with a different reality. Much of their existing electrical infrastructure had been destroyed during World War II. Cities had to be rebuilt from the ground up anyway. And the bombing damage had taught engineers a hard lesson. Above-ground infrastructure was vulnerable. Underground infrastructure survived. When European countries rebuilt their grids in the 1950s and 1960s, they made the deliberate choice to bury most of it. The cost was higher up front. The work was slower. But the resulting infrastructure was protected from storms, from accidents, from vehicles, from falling trees, from future bombing if such a thing ever happened again. First cause. The American post-war boom locked in above-ground infrastructure. By the time the European underground approach was proving its long-term value in the 1970s, the American grid was already largely built. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure was sitting on wooden poles across the entire country. Rebuilding all of it underground would have cost an estimated $1 to $3 trillion even at 1970s prices. It would have required tearing up every street in America. It would have left customers without power for years. The math was impossible. The decision was made implicitly. The grid would stay above ground. Here I have to admit something. When I started researching this video, I assumed Americans just preferred above-ground wiring for some practical reason I would discover. The data forced me to throw that assumption out completely. Americans do not prefer above-ground wiring. Polling consistently shows that most Americans would prefer underground utilities, particularly in neighborhoods prone to storms or hurricanes. The reason above-ground wiring stayed is not preference. It is sunk cost. The country invested so heavily in the wooden pole system that switching became economically impossible without a generational rebuild that nobody was willing to fund. The behavior did not precede the system. The post-war infrastructure choice created the system, and the system has outlived every reason for keeping it. Second cause. American geography and population density made underground wiring dramatically more expensive. This is the part that explains why even new American developments often still use above-ground wiring. The United States is geographically enormous and dramatically less densely populated than Western Europe. The average European country has approximately 10 times more people per square kilometer than the United States. Underground wiring is priced per mile. When you have to wire a sparse suburban neighborhood spread over many miles, the cost per home becomes much higher than in a dense European apartment block where the same length of underground cable serves dozens of households. A typical European city neighborhood has 80 to 200 households per kilometer of underground utility line. A typical American suburb has 8 to 20 households per kilometer. The European system is 10 times more efficient in terms of cost per customer for underground installation. This means that even when American utilities want to bury new lines in new developments, the economics fight them. The customers in sparse American neighborhoods would have to pay 5 to 10 times more for underground service than equivalent European customers. So the developments stay above ground. The wooden poles get installed. The country adds more miles of vulnerable infrastructure every year. Third cause. American utility regulation gave power companies no incentive to upgrade. Here's the cause almost nobody knows, and it is the one that locked the system in for the long term. American electric utilities are regulated monopolies. They are guaranteed a certain rate of return on their capital investments. But the rate they can charge customers is set by state utility commissions, which traditionally prioritize keeping consumer bills low rather than upgrading long-term infrastructure. What this means in practice is that an American utility has very little financial reason to spend billions of dollars on burying lines. They cannot pass the full cost to customers without regulatory approval. Customers do not want their bills to go up, so the lines stay above ground. Repairs happen after storms. The cycle continues. European utilities operate under different regulatory models. Many are state-owned or operate under cost-plus arrangements that allow them to pass long-term infrastructure costs to consumers gradually. The customer pays slightly more for electricity over decades, but the infrastructure stays reliable and storm-proof. Different incentives produce different infrastructure. Compare two neighborhoods for a moment. A typical American suburban street has wooden poles spaced every 50 feet, multiple wires sagging between them, transformer boxes mounted high on the poles, branches of nearby trees touching the wires, and an entire visible electrical infrastructure that residents stopped noticing decades ago. When a storm comes through, branches fall, wires snap, and the neighborhood loses power for hours or days while crews physically climb the poles to repair the visible damage. A typical German residential street has no visible electrical infrastructure at all. The wires are 6 feet below the sidewalk, protected from weather, from accidents, from vehicles, and from vegetation. When storms pass, nothing happens to the grid. Power continues uninterrupted. The infrastructure stays invisible because it was buried in 1965 and has barely needed maintenance since. Same century, same purpose. Two completely different relationships with electrical reliability. One country accepts regular outages as the cost of cheap infrastructure. The other treats outages as nearly impossible because the infrastructure was built to be invisible and protected. Stack those three causes together and you get the modern American power grid. A vast spider web of vulnerable above-ground wires that nobody loves, nobody designed for the modern era, and nobody can afford to rebuild. So embedded in the landscape that most Americans have never imagined a different version. So consistently vulnerable that storm damage is treated as a feature of American life rather than a fixable problem. Now here is where it gets interesting. A small number of American cities have started underground conversion projects in recent years. San Diego is gradually burying lines in fire-prone areas. Florida has been moving lines underground in hurricane zones. Some new developments in Texas and Arizona are being built underground from the start. But the pace is slow. Even with billion-dollar investments, the work is measured in decades. To bury all American power lines would take the rest of this century at current spending levels. The grid built between 1945 and 1975 will likely stay above ground until at least 2080. There is one detail worth noting. The recent surge in extreme weather events has made the above-ground problem worse, not better. Storms that used to knock out power for hours now knock it out for days. Wildfires sparked by above-ground lines have caused billions of dollars in damage in California. The infrastructure that was built for a different climate is now operating in a climate that is dramatically harsher than what it was designed for. Read that backwards. The American grid was not built for the world we live in now. It was built for the world of 1965. And the world of 1965 had fewer extreme storms, fewer wildfires, fewer hurricanes hitting outside the traditional Gulf zones, and less heat stress on equipment. The grid is aging into a climate that is actively breaking it faster than it is being repaired. The engineers of the 1950s and 1960s who designed the American above-ground system assumed it would be temporary. They expected future generations to bury the wires eventually. They could not have foreseen that economic and regulatory constraints would freeze the infrastructure in place for so long that their temporary solution would still be the dominant American grid in 2026 and beyond. Every power line hanging above your street today is a 1950s decision that nobody has been able to undo. How often does your power go out in storms? Do you remember being a child and seeing the lights flicker every time it rained? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how this varies across this channel. I read every single one.